It's just me. No, I don't suppose it was very scary, really, was it? And I think that is part of the problem with some of these classic and very well-known horror ideas and concepts, like that of Frankenstein. Over the last century or so, we've watered these ideas down so that we no longer find them as scary as perhaps audiences did years ago. And there's another character that suffers from this as well. This one, the vampire, or specifically Dracula. Now this is another one of those children's toys that is less than frightening. I keep it for storing my beard oil and medications. But what if I were to tell you that there is still a vampire legend that is scary? That's what this video is going to explore. We're going to look at the legend of the Barrowthorpe Vampire.
Barrowthorpe is a small hamlet situated in the Lincolnshire wolds. On the edge of Barrowthorpe is a disused chalk quarry. The quarry produced stone for roads in the marshland as well as agricultural lime. It ceased as a working quarry in the 1920s after a landslip covered the best deposits. Not long before the quarry closed, a skeleton was discovered in a small chamber where workmen had cut into the chalk face. An archaeologist was called in and determined it was likely to be Bronze Age, but before any further investigation could take place, the landslip occurred. Many of the quarrymen were superstitious and believed the landslip was a consequence of the body being disturbed. Once closed, the quarry fell silent, and gradually nature took charge. By the 1960s, the land had come under the auspices of the Wildlife Commission, and in 1963 the Commission sent one of their best botanists, Adeline Faber, to investigate the potential existence of the very rare flower known as Dead Man's Orchid. If found at Barrowthorpe Quarry, it would be the first confirmed sighting of the orchid in the UK for 60 years. Dead Man's Orchid is an unusual flower. It has no chlorophyll and instead obtains nutrients from fungi in the soil and other nearby plants in a parasitic manner. It may only flower once in 10 years, and when it does so, it is usually at night. If the orchid was found at Barrowthorpe, it would have been incredibly exciting for botanists. Adeline Faber knew the importance of her investigation.
She arrived in Barrowthorpe with a young assistant, a man by the name of Harry Bascombe. They set up camp here in the quarry and prepared to begin their research. The first night there was a full moon. Harry Bascombe was engaged in taking samples from the spot near to where the skeleton had been found years before. It was shortly after midnight that Adeline Faber heard a scream. It was that of Harry Bascombe. She came running over to find him, but he was not there. All that remained of Harry Bascombe was the cushion that he'd been kneeling on, his notebook, and his collection of samples. Immediately, Adeline Faber feared the worst and began looking around for him, fearing that perhaps he had fallen or stumbled somewhere. After a short while, she realised it was quite hopeless, and she went into Barrowthorpe in order to raise the alarm. It was shortly before dawn that she returned with a group of locals looking for Harry Bascombe. Just as the sun was rising, they found his body behind a large tree stump. He was alive, barely. Three days later, from his hospital bed, Bascombe was able to give an account of what had happened to him, as much as he could remember. He explained that a figure had attacked him from behind, and the only description he could give of this figure was that he was tall slender and incredibly powerful. The attacker slashed at Bascom's neck with what he thought was a blade. The young botanist managed to take hold of his secateurs and shoved them into the chest of the attacker, which meant that he ran away. Bascom staggered about then until he passed out. Once they had heard this account, police leapt into action and began a search of all nearby outbuildings and barns, but nothing was found. 4 days after this incident, Adeline Faber was back in the quarry taking samples. Just as the light was fading, she noticed that there was a figure watching her from above the tree line. She couldn't make out who or what it was, but she said that she felt very dizzy and afraid. The next thing she knew, the figure had disappeared, and a bat, or an owl perhaps, flew into the sky. Adeline, the next day, spoke with her superiors at the Wildlife Commission and told them what she had seen. Within days, talk of a Barrowthorpe vampire began to spread among the locals. Then, just a day or two after Adeline Faber spoke to the Wildlife Commission, a man named Saxon Granger arrived at Barrowthorpe. He was an unusual figure, for his occupation was that of a vampire hunter.
Who was Saxon Granger? To some, he was just a con man, but others believed him to be a powerful occultist and vampire hunter, a sort of 1960s Van Helsing. He was born in 1896, served in the First World War and travelled extensively around India and the Middle East, where he started his deep occult and esoteric study. In the 1920s, he began to hunt and kill vampires. He claims to have acted as a vampiric consultant for Howard Carter in 1922 and the discovery of the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. It is thought that during World War II, he used his skills in the fight against fascism and the Nazis' utilisation of occult forces. He wrote several books about his vampire hunting exploits. By the 1960s, he was all but retired, yet would make himself available for consultancy work if the situation intrigued him enough. It would appear that the Barrowthorpe incident was just such a situation, and clearly someone at the Wildlife Commission was able to persuade Granger to make the journey to Lincolnshire.
On his arrival at Barrowthorpe, Granger took lodgings in a nearby pub and began speaking with locals. Many also claimed that they had seen vampires and were more than happy to speak about their experiences. The only record we have of what happened while Granger was at the quarry comes from the diary of Faber herself, and this was only made public by her family in 2018, some 5 years after the botanist's death, at the age of 80. Here is what Adeline Faber wrote.
I thought that perhaps Mr. Granger was a little drunk when he arrived at the quarry. I could certainly smell alcohol on his breath. He began by stomping about with a pair of dowsing rods, and wasted no time in telling me that there had indeed been recent vampiric activity in the quarry, and that I had been incredibly brave. At this point he took hold of my hand and stroked my cheek. Had he tried to kiss me, I think I would have taken his rods and thrust them somewhere he would have found uncomfortable. Luckily, he had the sense to remain focused on the matter in hand, and led me to a part of the quarry I confess I hadn't noticed or explored. Here there was a small pit or chamber, covered in dried blood and the carcasses of different animals, all in various stages of decomposition. Mr. Granger told me that the chamber with blood-soaked walls is a typical space which a vampire will use to rest and rejuvenate. Many modern vampires, he went on, have ceased to use a coffin as their place of slumber. The presence of blood, even dried, is a comfort to the undead creature of the night, and promotes frequencies of rejuvenation. Granger next declared that in order to combat the vampire physically, he would have to go into a trance state, which could become violent. This was something he called necronoctambulism. At this point he shooed me away and advised that if I had a crucifix I ought to get it, or fashion one from a pair of sticks. Of course I did no such thing, and hoped that after all this nonsense was over I would be able to explore the new part of the quarry which Granger had led me to.
For the next hour, Faber listened to Granger doing psychic battle with what he believed to be the presence of a vampire. Of course, she wasn't convinced and believed that Saxon Granger was nothing more than a charlatan. When Granger did emerge from his fight, he was covered in cuts and slashes to the extent that Faber accepted they could not have been self-inflicted. Further to this, the ground where he had been was disturbed and filled with boot marks and claw marks. Granger declared his work to have been successful and that the vampire had been vanquished from the quarry. Indeed, there have been no further unusual sightings recorded at the quarry, at least not since 1988, when an illegal rave took place here, and several participants claim to have witnessed a strange figure similar to that seen by Faber 25 years earlier. And what of Faber? Well, on closer inspection of the spot where Granger had done battle with the vampire, she noticed something growing in the ground. Yes, incredibly, she had found a dead man's orchid at the Barrowthorpe quarry. She was astounded. Sadly, within a year of its discovery, the orchid had faded and died, but not before its seeds could be obtained. The Barrowthorpe quarry sample is now kept in storage at the Millennium Seed Bank in Kew Gardens. But was there really a vampire living here in an abandoned quarry? A vampire that was psychically destroyed by a man who claimed to be a vampire hunter? Or could there be another explanation for the sightings and the attack on the young botanist Harry Bascom? Well, there is an alternative explanation, and one which tries to debunk the notion of a vampire. I'll tell you what this other theory is, and you'll find that video over on my Patreon page. It's available to anyone who signs up and helps to support me and my work as a paranormal scrutineer. You can sign up for free as well and discover lots of bonus content. So, to learn about the true nature of the Barrowthorpe Vampire, please go to patreon.com/Occultaria. I'll see you over there. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.